Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila Horvitz, and this is Talk Back. We're doing live stream shows now on so many topics of interest, whether it be the pandemic to now. We're going to be doing some shows on racial justice with the ACLU and with the LGBTQ community, who had a very good decision yesterday in the Supreme Court. And I love to talk to people in the local area who are knowledgeable about our history, our politics, our literature. And I'm so happy today to have someone who is a wonderful, almost a fixture in the Norwich arts world and the literary world. I'm going to introduce her now to you and then say something about her background. We are now talking to Fay Ringel. Hi, Fay. Good to see you.
Hi, Sheila. I'm so happy to be here. Wish it could be in person. But...
All right. Well, we'll see each other in person soon, I hope. And so I want to introduce you. You sent me your CV. It's 1 million pages. I could go on and on and on, but people should know that you just are almost a Renaissance woman. You're involved in so many things in the community, in the arts world, as well as in literature. You're often a speaker at book clubs. You've written things. You are, and I'm going to just read a little bit from your CV, just to give people an idea of how varied your experience is. You are a professor emerita from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, where you taught in humanities. And most importantly for our show today, you are a lifelong resident of Norwich, Connecticut, born, raised, and living here. This has been your home forever. And you graduated from Brandeis, and you got your PhD in comparative literature from Brown University. You love Gothic literature, all kinds of literature. You've written some books. You've appeared as a featured writer in many, many articles and compendiums of various literary things. And you also are in the community with the vice president of the Norwich Arts Center and the Chelsea Players, which you helped to found. I've seen you directing plays. And so, Fay, there isn't anything that we really can ask you about. But today, I love the topic because you have unearthed 3 women who have connections with the city of Norwich, and you're calling the show, Norwich's Uppity Women Writers, and they go way back. So first of all, tell me about growing up in Norwich and your interest in literature and how that came about.
Wow. Well, as you said, I was born right here in Bacchus Hospital, and I cannot remember a time when I wasn't a reader. I have been reading practically before I could talk. I brought a book of the child's King Arthur to kindergarten with me, where the kindergarten teacher promptly said, "You can't read that," and it just broke my heart, because of course I could. I have always, because I've always read, I've also been fascinated with writers, and it seems as though many of my friends have become published writers of fiction usually. And I have had the privilege of writing about them. But in Norwich, I really became interested in Norwich's writers when I began working for the Norwich Bulletin in the summers, from the time I was 16 years old till I got out of college. And in those days, there was no internet, there were no online newspapers. I was actually reading the yellowed copies of the Norwich Bulletin and finding out about people and things that I really didn't know about. And I managed to discover Sarah Kemble Knight, Lydia Sigourney, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman before all of them were rediscovered by the second wave feminist movement. So that's just kind of a start.
Yeah, well, that's great. And the other thing that is featured prominently, of course, is the city of Norwich. And a little later, we're going to have a slideshow. I want you to express the evolution of Norwich. Back in the 1800s, it was one of the wealthiest cities in America, had many rich traditions. And as you were growing up in Norwich, did you know about that? When did you learn about the glorious history of Norwich and its evolution into the period of time when you were growing up? Talk about that.
Well, I I guess I was always interested in history. I mean, in 1959, during Norwich's tercentenary celebration, I was only 8 years old, but I read everything. I remember so well the attempt to vindicate Benedict Arnold. Bill Stanley had a lifelong crusade to get Arnold recognized not as the traitor he's known for, but as the Revolutionary War hero. He even wrote during the tercentenary time to President Eisenhower, asking him to issue a presidential pardon. I just was always fascinated by Norwich and its history, not so much its glory, but the dark shadows, because I've known that Gothic literature was for me, and since I was probably about 8 years old. The secrets, the things that people didn't want to talk about, the ghosts, literal and figurative, that haunted our history, the abandoned mills. I grew up in the years that the mills were being abandoned. It took me a long time to understand the economics behind it. But I knew that Norwich's past was more glorious than its present. And that history of decline, which is the Gothic is all about the fall and decline, is something that fascinated me from the time I could talk.
Oh, that's great. And so I think you mentioned Benedict Arnold. I think most people in Norwich sort of know about it, but people outside of Norwich may not know that he was from Norwich and his house is there. And as we get into your discussion of the writers, his house has a prominent role, isn't that so?
Yes, he kind of weaves into the story of Lydia Huntley Sigourney. But it is amazing how many people around here, let alone elsewhere, do not know that Benedict Arnold was born and brought up here. I'm a volunteer for the Norwich Historical Society's Heritage and Regional Visitors Center on the Norwich Town Green in the old Daniel Lathrop Schoolhouse, which also comes into Lydia Sigourney's story. And any visitors would come in and see all our displays about Arnold, and we have a cup that changes uniform. It goes from his blue Continental to a red coat uniform, and they have no idea that he was born and brought up here in Norwich.
That's so interesting. So now let's get to the the uppity women writers. So first, let's define our terms. Uppity. What is your definition of uppity? Why are you using that? Is it because were they unconventional? Were they outside the tradition? Were women not writing? Did they do things that violated the decorum or tradition of the time? Just give us a definition of uppity, and then we'll go on to talk about each one of these fascinating women.
Well, you just said it. It's all of the above. All three women in particular, just who by coincidence lived very close to each other, within very close walking distance at different times of history, managed to violate the conventions and traditions of the time. The idea of a woman being a professional writer was just about unknown. It was certainly unknown in the New World at the time that Madam Knight wrote her diary. And Lydia Huntley Sigourney was actually America's first published woman poet. And that's in the early 1800s. And even by the time Charlotte Perkins Gilman was writing, when there were many, many women writers, the idea of a woman writer who wanted to write on political and economic topics and who did a lot of things that were fairly radical, put her outside the mainstream of her time.
Interesting. Okay, so now let's get down to it. So we'll start with Lydia Huntley Sigourney, as you pronounced it. Who was she and when did she live?
So partly people may recognize the name pronounced Sigourney from the actress Sigourney Weaver. And I always hoped that she had named herself after Lydia, but it turns out that what she named herself after was Lydia's husband, who was the namesake for Sigourney Street in Hartford. And people pronounce it both ways. Her husband was a real estate developer, what's now is called Sigourney Square and Sigourney Street. That was all things he owned and developed. So that was disappointing. But I'm sure if Sigourney Weaver knew about Lydia, she would have named herself after that.
Well, maybe you can tell her. You've got to write and tell her.
She lived from 1791 to 1865, a good long time, and was born in Norwich, grew up in the house that we're going to keep coming back to today. That was it's now called, for a while it was called the Lathrop Manor B&B. It's the Lathrop Gilman house on Upper Washington Street, and I believe it's still for sale if anybody's interested. Been on the market a long time. Lydia was not a child of privilege. In fact, her parents were servants of the owner of the house, Madame Lathrop, the widow of Daniel Lathrop, who had died in early 1780s, and she was Lydia was the daughter of this gardener and maid, and Madame Lathrop kind of took her up as a cause and really raised her, was her patron, schooled her, gave her money, introduced her to society, and supported her. So
when did she? Yeah. How did she get her education?
She went to Norwich schools. Well, I think we can talk about it when we show the slides. She went to the two Norwich schools, but she was also a reader. She was a self-taught reader. By the time she started school, she had already taught herself Greek and Latin and was reading on a very high level, really anything she could get her hands on. And I'm pretty sure.
Was that unusual? Was that unusual for that time? Yeah.
Very, very unusual. Her brother was also educated by Madame Lathrop, and she used to steal his textbooks to teach herself math and science, because girls were almost never taught math and science. And what was really unusual was this drive from the earliest days that she writes about in her autobiography and in letters to transcend the kind of education that was usually available to girls of her time.
So how did her works get published or get disseminated during the time she was alive? How did that happen?
Well, that's really interesting, because perhaps if she'd stayed in Norwich, she would never have been published. Should I tell the story now of how she happened to leave Norwich, or would you rather wait?
Sure. No, sure. Tell it.
Okay, well, so everything that I've said so far is available in all printed sources, and there's, really no controversy about it, but there's a great controversy over why she happened to leave Norwich. We do know that she kept a school. We'll see a picture of it later, that she and her friend Nancy Hyde, who was equally a proto-feminist, wanted to educate young girls whose parents could afford a private school, but usually just sent them to what we now call finishing school, where they could learn to embroider and paint and do music. So she and Nancy opened a school where they actually taught them girls mathematics and science, all the things that they had to struggle to learn themselves. And this was in the 1812, 1813, when they were, pretty young themselves. Each year they moved to a new place because the schools were not a commercial success. And by the end of the second year, they realized that they could not continue. Parents were just pulling their girls out and refusing to pay tuition for their girls to be taught these subversive things. At that point, what we do know from her letters is that she tried to open a Sunday school for Black students. For what she Norwich had at that time quite a large population of free people of color. There were still slaves, but there were many free people of color, some of whom went on to great fame, the abolitionist David Ruggles, the Harris sisters, who attended Prudence Crandall's school. But in 1813, there was no school for them and no Sunday school. So she started this Sunday. The record just goes blank. Something happened between 1813 and 1814 that made her close the Sunday school and leave Norwich. And she was she herself did not write about it. She just, in her autobiography, she just said, I had the Sunday school and then I had to leave. And her mother, Madam Lathrop had died, but her mother had tried to keep her in Norwich and had opposed her moving to Hartford. Madam Lathrop had taken her to Hartford several times, where she met some famous people. We'll come back to in a minute. Why? Overnight, the mother changed her mind and said, Lydia, you're moving to Hartford. And she did.
So you think there may have been some controversy with her teaching Black students? Is that what you think perhaps happened?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, you use the term, Fay, proto-feminist. Proto-feminist. Why don't you define it? These are the beginning writings of women coming into their own independence. Is that what you're talking about? What do you mean by it?
Absolutely. The feminist movement in England was well underway. The famous Mary Wollstonecraft, who's probably more famous for being the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft in the 1790s had published about the rights of women. But this had not made its way to the New World, and as far as I know, there's no way that that Lydia could have read that. Might have heard about it, but there were the term feminist was not yet used. But the idea that women deserved rights, that women had natural rights, was really just coming on the scene. So I say proto-feminist because she would not have recognized the word feminist. But Lydia Sigourney, had many of the ideas that became standard in the feminist movement, which eventually she caught up with in the 1840s and 1850s. She believed that women should be educated, should be allowed to pursue business, should have equal rights. And eventually,
and so then she had a separate life in Hartford that we'll talk about, right? Just give us a brief overlay of that, then we'll look at the slides on that.
Well, the reason that she came to be published is that one of Madam Lathrop's friends in Hartford was Daniel Wadsworth, who founded the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And he was a great patron of the arts and literature, and he became interested in her and persuaded her first to publish some little kind of essays, and then he underwrote, because poetry was no more profitable back then than it is today. He underwrote the publication of her book of verse. And that book of published verse, as I said, was the first one to be published professionally by a woman. Well, it was, much to people's surprise, it was successful. And beginning in the 1820s, publishers, regular publishers, not requiring any kind of subsidy, took up the cause of Lydia Sigourney, and she began to publish prolifically. And so between the 1820s and her death, she published everything from volumes of essays, how-to books, books on education, memoirs, and many, many volumes of poetry. So in Hartford, she very quickly, she opened a school, and within a year, it was a great success. She kept this school for several years, and then she married Charles Sigourney. On the one hand, he, quote unquote, allowed her to continue her working and her writing. But on the other hand, he eventually asked her to close the school and, devote herself more to him. But then, of all things, his business went bankrupt. His real estate business went bankrupt, and she became the sole income source in the family. So until his death, he may not have been happy about it, but she became the breadwinner.
So that's pretty unusual. It's pretty
It,
unusual to have a woman in that period of time in the 1800s being the primary breadwinner and earning money from writing poetry and other essays. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
yes, it is. It is. By the late 1830s and 1840s, she had a national reputation. She went to England, where she was introduced to Queen Victoria. She met all of the English famous writers at the time, like Charles Dickens and Thackeray. She was really internationally famous.
And have you read some of her poetry or most
I
of it?
have. I have. The problem is, that our tastes have changed today. We don't, our poets don't write in rhyme. She was famous for what we for memorial verse. She wrote what you might call elegies, funeral elegies that were famous. But some of her poems have held up very well and could really use being reprinted. For instance, she wrote something that in 1834 that sounds so modern. Its theme is it's almost unbelievable. She was asked to write a poem for the dedication of the Mohegan Congregational Church, which still stands today in Mohegan, that is Uncasville. And she wrote a poem dedicated, she said, to the once powerful tribe of Mohegan Indians, and that she describes their history and how badly they were treated by whites. She brings out all kinds of things that we think are new, but were talked about in the 1830s, how we stole their land and killed their people and exiled them and so on.
That's interesting because I was reading some of the things you sent me, how she was a champion for Native American rights in this country, which was not something that was very common back then either. She was ahead of her time, no question. So do we want to move on to Gilman now, or do we want to say anything else about
I'd like
Lydia?
Yeah, well, I guess, I don't know, how much time do we have? How long are we going?
We have as long as you need, Faye. Keep going.
Well, I think it's worthwhile to just read the end of that poem for the Mohegan Church, where she says, "Crushed race, so long condemned to moan, scorned, rifled, spiritless and lone, from pagan rites, from sorrow's maze, turn to these temple gates with praise. Yes, turn and bless the usurping band that rent away your father's land. Forgive the wrong, suppress the blame, and view with faith's fraternal claim your God, your hope, your heaven the same."
That's beautiful, actually.
Isn't it?
Very
Isn't
nice.
it
Yes.
amazing that she thought then how incredible it was that the Mohegans could then forgive the race that had so treated them and pray to God.
Right. And that church is still there, isn't it, on
Yes.
the location where the Mohegans have their museum in that area in
Yes.
Uncasville?
Yes.
Yes.
It's just off
Very
Route 30.
interesting. Very interesting.
Okay,
well, let's move on to Gilman.
Charlotte Perkins Stetson Gilman was not born in Norwich. She was actually born in Hartford, of a Hartford family. But that family, which was related to families in Norwich, also produced the more famous writer Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was this interconnecting family. The Gilman, that eventually is her last name, was the name of her first cousin, Houghton Gilman, whom she later married. So if this isn't complicated enough, we know that she is more famous nationally now than anyone else I've been talking about, but she was, she was rediscovered by the second wave feminist movement in the late 60s and early 70s, just about a few years after I had discovered her. I'm kind of proud of that. So she lived until 1935 and spent the last 20 years of her life in Norwich. And even though there have been many biographies written about her, you'd think that it never happened. None of them really get into the Norwich connection at any length, because she really did the work that she's famous for beginning in the 1890s through 1910, which was before she arrived in Norwich. She's most famous today, though, for one of her very few fiction stories called The Yellow Wallpaper. And The Yellow Wallpaper is what we today movies say that they're inspired by true events. She was indeed similar to the heroine narrator, unnamed narrator of that story. She suffered postpartum depression after the birth of her daughter. The story, for anybody who hasn't read it, is definitely worth reading. In fact, it's one of the most assigned stories in college American literature classes, turns up in the greatest number of anthologies. In The Yellow Wallpaper, the narrator is essentially imprisoned in the attic of a family home by her husband, because the well-meaning Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, a real person, had prescribed a rest cure. And S. Weir Mitchell's rest cure was especially used on women who dared to write or attempt to work outside the home. It was thought that this is what was causing their depression, their breakdown, their craziness, and the only way to cure them would be to isolate them, keep them on a bland diet, and not allow them to write. In the story, this treatment makes the heroine, the narrator, go crazy for real, and she starts seeing women hidden behind the wallpaper of this room in which she's imprisoned in the attic. In real life, this did happen to Charlotte Perkins, who at that time was married to someone named Stetson. He did try to prescribe the rest cure, but unlike her story, she ran away. She got out and left, and she went to California, which even in 1890, it was easier to get a divorce there than it is in New England. She got a divorce. She got custody of the child, and then it got even weirder. The story ends more like a ghost story. We don't quite know what happened. In real life, Gilman realized that her ex-husband was much more financially stable and able to raise this daughter, but she didn't want she didn't want him to raise her alone. She arranged for her best friend, Grace Channing, to marry her ex-husband and become the mother of her child. And this
so that was pretty uppity for that time.
Exactly. That was the real scandal. More so than running away from her husband. This idea that she remained on good terms with the second wife, and in fact remained part of her daughter's life in that way. Meanwhile,
and toward the end of her life, I think I read from what you sent me, she did have a relationship and was with her daughter toward the end of her life. Isn't that so?
Exactly. Unfortunately, it was to die. When she was diagnosed with breast cancer in the early 1930s, and there was no cure, she could no longer live alone in Norwich, and she moved back to where her daughter was living in California at that time, where she eventually committed suicide.
Wow. So she also, aside from that one piece that was very popular and is used today, she also wrote political philosophy, economic theory, and things of that nature about women's role in the economy and politics in that. Isn't that so?
Absolutely. Her textbook, Women in Economics, was the first such and was actually used in many, many colleges up until the 1920s, when the world changed. But it was a groundbreaking work. And she published what we today would call a fanzine. It would probably be a blog today, called The Forerunner. And The Forerunner was way, way out there in to the far left of the political spectrum. She espoused many causes for women's rights, the right of women to have credit, to own property, to run businesses. And she also believed in in loosening up the marriage laws and custody and all of that. The only thing that that today she would be considered not so wonderful is that she also did espouse eugenics, and that was a problem. She was not happy about immigration, and she did tend to think that that she didn't believe in what's called negative eugenics, the extermination of the unfit races, but she believed that educated women should be encouraged to have at least one child in or out of wedlock, because she felt that she felt that educated, and it's true, that educated women then and now tend to have fewer children.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that we're talking about this today, because I've been doing some shows on the suffragette movement and the fact that this is the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in 1920 in the 19th Amendment. And of course, Gilman lived through that period. You said she died in 1935. Now, Fay, you did a program on her, and you dressed somewhat in costume, and we have a picture of that later. Isn't that so?
Yes, that was for the Otis Library. We were celebrating Norwich's 350th anniversary in 2009, and they asked me to do this program. Interestingly, Norwich had some really great commemorations of its history for its 250th and its 300th. Both times presidents came and took part. In 1909, then President Taft opened the festivities and marched in the parade, and there were beautiful commemorative volumes in 1859 and 2000 in 1909. By 2009, it was a very low-key celebration, and there were no presidents, not even a governor, if I recall.
Okay. So let's turn to the third woman who lived earlier and became most famous, although she lived in Norwich, for writing a tract about dangerous travel in those times between Boston and New York. And who is that? And let's talk about her.
Her name was Sarah Kemble Knight, but she was always known as Madam Sarah Kemble Knight. She was born in Boston and died in New London, but in between did live in Norwich. And she was a teacher in Boston. She ran what was called a dame school, which was not necessarily for dames. It was for little boys and little girls to teach them their basic alphabet and letters. And among her little pupils in Boston was Benjamin Franklin. And also,
wow.
Yes, she was one of his earliest teacher. She invested in real estate, and she was known for her business acumen. And it was to settle a will, some property in a will that caused her to go from Boston to New York in 1704. In 1704, there was something called the Boston Post Road, which we still have remnants of today, that went down the coast. And there were no stagecoaches even as yet. There were horses, and she rode horseback or walked from Boston to New York over a period of several months. And she recorded it in a fascinating journal where all the horrible things that happened to her, how difficult it was to cross rivers. As you know, there are a lot of bridges between Boston and New York on the coast, either on horseback or on a road ferry. She had to stay overnight in inns, and there are hilarious accounts of the dreadful conditions that she had to sleep in, sometimes having to share a bed with strange men because there were no separate rooms, sometimes having to literally sleep under the table in taverns. And she survived, and she kept that journal. She got the money from the will that was settled. Eventually, just a few years later, she was able to buy a building in Norwich that still stands on the Norwich Town Green and that became known as the Sarah Knight Tavern, where she kept a tavern on the green. And for several years, she was actually thriving. Hard as it is to believe that the beautiful, peaceful Norwich Town Green was mostly taverns in the 18th century. It was the place where the road to New London Turnpike, met the road to Hartford, Old Route 2, and there were lots and lots of taverns. She became so prosperous that she actually donated a beautiful silver plate to the First Congregational Church, and she sat in a pew with her name on it, because in those days, the richer you were, the closer you could get to God by being in a front pew. Her success made the other merchants jealous, and there's no other way to explain it, because they brought a lawsuit against her, claiming that she was selling firewater to the Indians and getting them drunk, which all of them were doing. But the court did rule against her, and she had to pay a fine, and this turned her off on Norwich, and essentially she was driven out. Her daughter, meanwhile, had settled in New London. She moved to New London to be with her daughter, and she died there in 1727, and she's buried in their ancientest burial ground.
Interesting. So the diary that she wrote about her travels between Boston and New York, was that published during her lifetime? When did it become well known? Was it ever really popular? And how was it discovered?
It was discovered by someone in the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it had ended up. I have no idea. I think it was because she did go back to Boston before she moved to Norwich, and her papers went to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Because of the connection to Benjamin Franklin, there was great interest taken in her diary, and it was published in the 19th century. A paper was read in 1909 that talks about how very popular this diary was, this fascinating woman connected to some of the most prominent figures of colonial America. And it was published by the publisher Isaiah Thomas of Worcester, who became quite famous himself, one of America's first successful commercial publishers. And she, by legend, is supposed to have, when she returned to Boston, written on a window pane, "Through many toils and many frights, I have returned, poor Sarah Knight. Over great rocks and many stones, God has preserved my fractured bones."
So this is great. So all three of these women are having somewhat of a renaissance or rediscovery. Isn't that right? You've discovered them, but other people have as well?
Yes, although, the Diary of Sarah Knight is now available on the internet, but I don't think there's an in-print copy. There have been lots of in-print copies over the years, usually as little gift books. But as far as Lydia Sigourney goes, not enough of a rediscovery. Yes, thanks to the internet, you can now read her works, but nobody's rushing to do a modern edition of her poetry. And the same with, on the other hand, Charlotte Perkins Gilman has, yes, besides the yellow wallpaper being so popular, a number of her books are in print. They're studied in colleges. She's become, she's studied in women's studies and women's history courses. So yes, she's probably the best known nationally.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some slides, and you're going to do some commentary on all three of these women and how they're connected to Norwich, potentially. Okay, and we have Norwich Uppity women writers, and here we go. You see that, Fay?
Yes.
That's Norwich, probably in the 1800s.
Yes, it's a postcard from the late 1800s. Norwich had streets lined with beautiful elms before the Dutch elm disease and then the hurricane of 1938. And we talked earlier about Norwich's period of prosperity. Norwich had two. The area that's around the Norwich Town Green was very prosperous in the 1700s to say the War of 1812. Norwich was a great trading center, but then when the ships got larger, Norwich's harbor was not really as good for the larger ships. And still, what happened in the 18th century is that farmers from inland Connecticut would bring all of their wares to Norwich, and then they would be floated downstream to New London, and that continued. But when the railroads came, again, that was less necessary. However, Norwich's water power led to great periods of industrialization, and through the 19th century, Norwich was one of the great industrial centers of the world. And there was a time in the second half of the 19th century when Norwich had more millionaires per capita than any other town.
Wow, that's interesting. Now look at that house on the right, the yellow. Isn't that still standing on Broadway? It looks like a house you see when you drive down.
Yeah, Broadway and that part of Washington Street and Broadway became known as the Millionaire's Triangle. And Patricia Staley's very good book about that will give you all the details.
Right. Let's go forward. The Leffingwell Inn.
Yes. Now that's from Norwich's first period of prosperity, when Norwich was home to many, shall we say, traders, merchants. Christopher Leffingwell did very well out of the Revolutionary War, famous for supplying food to the army and for introducing the hot chocolate as a great way to not drink tea.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that came from Norwich. Wow.
Yeah.
That looks like an old Norwich.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, downtown, that's where the bridge to Laurel Hill now stands, looking at the downtown from the Laurel Hill side. The reason that the buildings around the Norwich Town Green are still standing is that the commercial center of Norwich moved downtown. Norwich Town Green was the original commercial center. All of those buildings were not residences. They were either taverns or stores. But when the harbor, what became known as Chelsea Landing, became the commercial center of Norwich, all of those buildings were kind of left behind by history. And the downtown, what we call downtown, is like literally down. So all downhill. The rivers go that way until they form the Thames River downtown, which at that time was a harbor that could take ships. Today, of course, we have bridges along the Thames that make it difficult for larger ships to go upriver.
Oh, here's another scene from Broadway. Wow, it looks like a magnificent boulevard, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's why it was called Broadway. It was developed that way. And that's where the millionaires built their homes. And actually on that green, I hope we'll see, is there were some older sea captains who built homes in that area. And one of those homes was the site of Lydia Huntley's first school. Yeah, there's the downtown showing the different hills that meet in downtown Norwich.
Now this was a anniversary, 1859, and there's the famous Swaregan Hotel where Lincoln stayed right before his election in 1860, right?
Yes, yes. In fact, it was that building still stands today and has been restored to something pretty close to the appearance in this postcard. But yes, this gives you an idea of what a huge celebration the 1859 200th anniversary was. And thinking of Lydia again, Lydia Sigourney in 1859 was certainly the most famous Norwich native daughter. And they did not invite her to put one of her poems in the published volume. And this bothered her to the end of her life.
Oh, fascinating. Franklin Square.
Yes.
Now there's a streetcar, so that might be turn of the century. Do you know about when this was?
Yeah, it looks, since there aren't many automobiles and there are still streetcars, it's probably any time up until the 1920s.
Right. And there's another
There's the
one,
Warwigan
Broadway from
again.
the Shannon. Yeah.
Yeah, looking towards City Hall, which, as we know, when it was built in the just following the Civil War, cost over $1 million. A million
Wow.
for real in 1869 money, not today's money.
Here's another one, East Main Street looking west.
Yeah, that's on the other side of the bridge over the Shetucket, looking towards what we still call the East Side, looking towards 165 and Route 2.
Yeah, it looks much broader than the street is now.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Oh, and there it
There's
is.
City Hall, right? Grand.
Beautiful building.
Okay.
You know what
So
this house represents?
I can't see well enough to, but again, that looks like first period building, certainly from the earliest times. Ah,
Oh,
there we
here's
are.
one.
This the Zebulon Burnham House is the only place in Norwich that has any recognition of Lydia Huntley Sigourney. There is a plaque out front. You can kind of see it in the I don't know if you make it big again, but this stands opposite the Little Plains Park, the little park between Union Street and Broadway. And this was the site of the school for 1 year. The plaque did not exist when I was growing up. I mean, it was only put up within the last 10 years, and it's got several errors on it, unfortunately. And of course, no mention of her having been driven out of Norwich.
Right. Laurel Hill.
Yes, and the mill, some mills, probably looks like could be Thermos. Okay.
Another postcard from Norwich.
Yep.
Get to see the rivers. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Franklin Square in 1900. It looks almost Capra-esque. You know, the filmmaker Capra, Frank Capra. Looks
Yes.
beautiful.
Yes.
And again, another one. I think that's the same one. And here she is. Here's a bust. How was that made? And when was that created? Do you know?
Yes. This was what we didn't talk about was her role in the development of the American School for the Deaf. She was the pioneering teacher of the deaf in America. Her first pupil, Alice Cogswell, was the first student to learn what became American Sign Language. And Lydia worked with Alice Cogswell's father and several other people to found the American School for the Deaf in Hartford. And this bust was commissioned for the American School for the Deaf. And
that school still exists today, doesn't it?
It certainly does. The bust was made in 1842 by a distinguished American artist and can still be found there today.
Great. All right, here are some drawings of her.
Mm-hmm.
That's what kind of she looked like. Aha. Now this.
Yes.
Lydia attended this school.
Yes, I mentioned that Norwich now has a visitor center, not open this summer, but hopefully will open again. And this was an opening ceremony with some reenactors on the green. The building was the Daniel Lathrop Schoolhouse, which was built in 1783 under the terms of Dr. Daniel Lathrop's will. He wanted there to be a co-ed school, maybe again the influence of young Lydia. He wanted there to be a co-ed school that would teach the higher elements above grammar school and would be open to all. It was sort of like the way NFA is, was open to all, tuition free under the terms of, but administered as a town school. And it's, you can see some of the artifacts from that time if you go and visit. Lydia Huntley, later Sigourney, attended this school for several years, the equivalent of high school.
Here she is again, very elegant.
Yes,
now,
younger.
of our three women that we're talking about, did they wear traditional clothing? Did they wear unusual clothing? Were they iconoclastic in their dress, or were they just conventional in their dress?
Okay. I don't know about Sarah Kemble Knight. There are no actual contemporary portraits of her. There have been various attempts to guess what she looked like, but we don't know. It was rare for ordinary women to have their portraits painted in 1700. But by the time Lydia came along, she was not unconventional in dress. She dressed just like everyone else in her time, but Charlotte Perkins Gilman was definitely unconventional. She was a crusader against corsets. She was one of those who believed that women should not corset themselves and force their bodies into weird shapes. She also despised fashion. She essentially wore the same clothing right up to her death in 1935, so that when you see photographs of her, because now we have cameras, she seems to be wearing the same clothes, and she was.
All right. We'll check into her. She's coming up next. So this is another school where Lydia went.
Yes.
Does this building still exist?
The East District School still exists on Upper Washington Street, literally across the street from the Lathrop house where Lydia grew up. And this school was also co-ed. She attended it from several years during what we think of elementary school years. And it was in use late into the 1800s. It was given eventually to the city, deteriorated, sat vacant for a long time. And now the Norwich Historical Society has been trying to raise money to restore it.
Interesting. Here she is again. The perfect library. I guess they have her published works in this.
Well, that's what they call an internet download publisher. It's not a real publisher.
Okay.
They take and they just, they take it off the internet. Is that the biography, the Gordon Haight biography?
Yes, this is called why was she called the Sweet Singer of Hartford? We know she moved there and married Mr. Sigourney.
And remained there the rest of her life. And that's where she had, she really threw off all connections with Norwich, because she, was famous as being a Hartford. That's where her books were published. And so she was.
Right. This was published by the Yale University Press in 1930.
Exactly. And that was the last biography written of her. And it is such a shame. There has yet to be a modern biography of her. And Gordon Haight, spelled Haight, ought to be known as Gordon Haight, Hate, because he was a hater. He didn't like her. This was his doctoral dissertation from Yale, and Yale had a bad relationship with her. One of the great disappointments in her life was that she was never invited there or anything, and that when her autobiography called Letters of Life came out towards the end of her life, she got a killer review from the then president of Yale, who actually made fun of her and was really responsible for lowering her reputation.
So where did the Sweet Singer come in? That's a very nice moniker.
Well, it is, because that's what she was known as in her life.
Okay.
So, he set out to write a book about her, but then he spent the rest of the time saying how old-fashioned her poetry was and how she was a promoter and she wasn't good. And it's terrible. And of course, he clearly didn't do any research into Norwich either. Because
right.
And the only good thing we could say about it is that book's been out of print a long time.
Okay. So now here's some of her comments and sayings, educating our children. Do we know that our children also educate us? Okay. Yeah. And there's another called Forgotten Books. Is that also an internet publication? Yeah. Just some of the things. Another quote from her. In early childhood, you may lay the foundation of poverty or riches, industry or idleness, good or evil, by the habits to which you train your children. Teach them right habits then, and their future life is safe. She was an educator at heart.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's another. So she's in the Natural Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans. Interesting.
Yeah, the collection, she was in it for every edition from 1830 something on. In 1839, I was interested to note that she was the only writer listed alongside the generals, the politicians, the bankers, and the only woman other than Abigail Adams.
Wow, interesting. And now, which property is
That's
this?
Yes, that's the Daniel Lathrop and Gilman house on Upper Washington Street.
And they both were in that house.
Yes, as was Benedict Arnold, who did his apprenticeship with Dr. Daniel Lathrop.
Wow. So why aren't there 22 plaques in front of that house for all the historical events that occurred there and interesting people?
Good question.
Yeah, we should do that, Faye. You should do that. Get started. Oh, and this, I guess, is when she
Yes,
went to This must be Hartford.
that was some of the land that her husband owned.
Right.
Yeah, that was in Hartford. There
There
she
she
is
is
again.
again,
Yeah,
older and more, as you say, pretty traditional garb, probably.
yeah.
Oh, Letters of Life,
Yes,
something else. Yeah.
yeah, that was her autobiography. Mhm.
Strive to exhibit in your own lives and conversation. In other words, do what we do, not just what we say.
Yes,
Right?
yeah,
Live
yeah.
by example. Uh-huh. So was she in her economics, did she express any views against capitalism or was it not that?
Well, not really, but she did, unlike Charlotte Perkins Gilman, she actually welcomed immigrants, and she did a lot of work with immigrants to Hartford, and she ended up helping some refugees from the revolutions of the 1840s.
Another book, Letters to Mothers,
Yes.
commemorating the Foundation for American Christian Education, Golden
Hmm.
Anniversary. Here she is again. And the strength of a nation, especially of a Republican nation, is in the intelligent and well-ordered homes of the people.
Yeah. She was somewhat at odds with the really radical feminists of her time, Susan B. Anthony, for instance. She was she shared a lot of their views, but she, I would say she was more conservative as far as her Christianity and her support of traditional roles at home.
Right?
Yeah.
Soul of a woman lives in love.
Mhm.
And now we come to Gilman. This is a young Gilman. Uh, I like the expression on her face. She's a determined young woman.
She was. She actually went to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, again one of the early women to graduate from there, and put herself through. Worked from the time that she was born. She was definitely from the poor branch of an old distinguished family, and so she was always self-supporting.
And here she is, older woman, again, very determined, and wearing somewhat unconventional clothing. We'll see that in the other portraits too. Here she is,
Yeah.
another one. These great hat.
Yes.
Ah, where
Yeah.
was she
That's
here?
famous. I don't know. I was trying to track that down, but certainly she was involved with so many different causes, and not surprising that she found her that someone captured her speaking to a crowd.
Right. We're
She,
gonna research this, Faye, and get the answer to exactly where this is.
well, maybe, but what we do know and what's well documented is that she was a tireless speaker and traveler. Up until she moved to Norwich from the 1890s through 1913 or 14, she was on a train just about every day. She would go anywhere to speak to any audience for just about any cause, and of course, this was a source of income. This was her main source of income. One of the sad things is that by the time she was settled in Norwich, about 1918, 1919, this dried up. she had become suddenly old-fashioned. As the 20s came in, the flappers thought of her as one of these old ladies that they were rebelling against. And her economics had fallen out of fashion. She stopped getting invitations. And she, to the end of her life, the one thing we know from her letters is that she regretted and was angry that she was never asked to speak at Connecticut College in New London.
Ah, interesting.
And so, like the
Young
others,
lady. Oh, this is
as a
something back.
pattern, no, sorry,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
This is Sigourney. We have to skip. We'll skip that. Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. The pattern that we've seen all day today is that, like the prophets who were not honored in their own country, these women were not honored in Norwich. They, Gilman was not driven out, but she was poor, and she and her husband continued working. The Depression really hit them very hard, but they were certainly not honored while they lived here. Lydia Sigourney had to leave, or whether she was physically driven out or just kind of shunned, she had to leave. And Sarah Knight would have practically had the tavern burned around her ears if she hadn't left.
Interesting. Well, you're gonna welcome them all back, which we're doing today. We're welcoming them back to Norwich. The Living Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's an autobiography.
Yeah, her autobiography is in print. I discovered it in the Otis Library during the years when it was decidedly out of print, and it just opened up a whole new world to me.
Yeah, and this must be her daughter.
Yeah,
I'm assuming, right?
A rare picture.
And A Lost Feminist Utopian Novel by Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Herland is now taught in a lot of colleges. Again, I have that very copy. It was a rediscovery. It was never actually commercially published in her lifetime. She self-published it in her journal, The Forerunner, and it was very popular among her, sort of the people who knew her, but it didn't have the national fame until long after her death. Yes, it's an imagined utopia somewhere in the mountains of South America where women have learned to reproduce without the aid of men, parthenogenesis. And there's no one and it's just a perfect society of all women.
Wow, it's a counterpart to The Handmaid's Tale, which is just the opposite.
Yeah, the thing with her, well, the reason that's why Herland is a utopia rather than a dystopia. Herland is an imagination of what a perfect society could be in her mind.
Right. The first duty of a human being is to assume the right functional relationship to society, more briefly, to find your real job and do it.
Yes, that sounds like her.
This is just in her handwriting. I didn't really. January 1899. Thank you for your appreciative words. Just to see her cursive writing. Yeah. Thank you letter. The Yellow Wallpaper and Other Stories. This is published in many varieties. This is just one of them.
Yes. And
there that sounds. Is. I love that.
She could have certainly written that.
Yes. This is interesting. The Crux. Have you heard of that one?
No, that one's new to me.
Interesting. Here she is again. The Feminism of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Sexualities, Histories, Progressivism. So people are commenting on her. And again, we should write to Judith Allen, the author of that book, and ask her where that photograph was taken.
That's right. Okay.
Maybe she knows. I'll give you that assignment. Here's a lovely photograph of Perkins Gilman with her daughter. Again, very nice. And again.
Yeah, that's the
this original. Is all about.
Yes, and that's the Feminist Press, their bestseller all the years. That's that was their rediscovery, really. In the years between 1892 and that Feminist Press rediscovery in the late 60s, Yellow Wallpaper was usually read as a ghost story. And that's how I first discovered it. I discovered it in an anthology of ghost stories They thought that, that there was a literal ghost behind the wallpaper, and yet, reading it now, it's hard to read as anything other than an allegory of feminism and crushing of feminism.
Well, it's interesting that the Atlantic Constitution magazine thought enough of her prominence to give her an article, What is Feminism? And she's prominently displayed as Mrs. Gilman sees feminists. We don't have the, you and I can take a look at the actual words of that. Wild Unrest, another Charlotte Perkins Gilman and the Making. It's another biography, yes.
Yeah, I have that
I like
one.
the title, Wild Unrest. It's a great title. Again, there's that same youthful photo of her. And again, the older version, the more mature. Again, with regards to the author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, being a warning to those who have the care of, I guess she's doing something about health issues in this note.
Yes. Actually, it's fascinating. Some of her ideas some people say she predicted the takeout revolution. She always said that women were slaves to their kitchen, and if only there could be places where you could go and get already prepared meals and bring them home.
And she was also a preacher of some.
Yeah, she was also part of the progressive movement. She was very upset with poor health conditions and poor food processing and all of the things that were exposed by the progressives.
So there are a lot of articles as well as books written about her.
Yes, as they say, be careful what you wish for. When I was growing up, I always hoped to be famous and to have plays produced on Broadway, and I have Broadway in Norwich. And I'm famous in Norwich.
That's funny because I live in Colchester on Jaffe Terrace, but it's off Broadway, the name of the street. So I live off Broadway. Okay. Oh, here we go again. Another version of Herlin that you've talked about. Best works. I love that that vision of her. Very pretty there. The labor of women in the house certainly enables men to produce more wealth than they otherwise could. And in this way, women are economic factors in society, but so are horses. Well, I think that's fantastic because, we always trying to quantify the value of women's work in the home. And she's way ahead of her time in this comment, which is terrific. Terrific. I don't know where this comes from. I don't know if this is Gilman or this is her. Do you know anything about this one?
No, sorry.
Something related to her. Again, collected works and her visage. Interesting. Sometimes they use the youthful visage image of her and other times the more mature. So, novels, short stories, poetry, the yellow wallpaper, utopian feminist, suffered severe postpartum depression after birth of her daughter. You talked all about that. Famous quotation, there is no female brain. The brain is not an organ of sex. Might as well speak of a female liver. Fantastic. I love it. Here it is, what you talked about.
Which is now back in print, yes. And it remains amazingly up to date.
And now comparing her with her contemporaries. And again, that same photograph. Here she comes running out of prison and off the pedestal, chains off, crown off, halo off, just a live woman. Great. So when the great word mother rang once more, I saw at last its meaning and its place. Not the blind passion of the brooding past, but mother, the world's mother, come at last to love as she had never loved before, to feed and guard and teach the human race. Nice. And now here we come to Sarah Kemble Knight as we finish up our third uppity woman.
Yeah, I can't. It's too small for me to read.
Private Journal of Sarah Kemble Knight, being the record of a journey from Boston to New York in the year 1704, Norwich, Connecticut, published by the Academy Press.
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. That was
All right, here it is.
there. It is.
Tavern.
It doesn't. It's painted blue now. It looks different, but it's there
Wow.
on 8 Elm
And
Avenue.
there,
Yeah,
and there
some
are
of
many.
the many editions of her. Again, all of those illustrations are, which just artists' guesses at what it might have been like.
Right. Again, there were many. Yeah, this is many instances of trying to capture the map and all the places she went to in that journey. And again, this
Yeah.
shows where she died, 1727, in her 62nd year. That iconic horseback ride with her. Again, the map, so many of that in the things we saw about her. And here again, tracing her steps from Boston to New York. And again, variations of the publications. Is this another internet, the private journal of a journey from
Yeah.
Boston to New York?
Yeah. I recognize that.
And more of that. Things that beautiful scenes. Again, another iteration of the same thing. This one published in I don't know where this one was published.
Yeah,
But
that's
that's
right. Looks like a facsimile of the Isaiah Thomas one.
yeah. So now we're back, Faye. I think we've 3 women. I want to say that this was terrific, that we've unearthed these characters that you felt Norwich did not ever really give them their due, and you certainly gave them their due today. And I want people to appreciate the breadth and scope of your knowledge about the history of where you grew up, of Norwich, of the interesting city it has been all throughout the centuries, and how much you are aware of it and part of keeping it alive. So I really, really thank you for doing this. I think it's terrific. And would you like to say a few last words about these 3 women, how we should remember them, and what Norwich should continue to do to try to keep their memories alive?
Well, I want to thank you, Sheila, for all of your research and putting together that beautiful slideshow. Wow, great images. It's really difficult. The further back you go in history, the harder it is to find actual images. But I want to give a shout out to Dale Plummer, Norwich's city historian, who single-handedly found out a lot of the stuff about, particularly about Lydia Sigourney and her schools and the school for the African American children. What Norwich has been doing to really only in the last few years is that there are a number of walks. There are a number of historical walks, which can be, there are printed pamphlets. You can go to the Norwich Historical Society's website, and you can actually take an audio tour. You can download that information. And so little by little, this information is getting out there, but we haven't yet put together an Uppity Women Walk. We may do that, but thanks to Walktober, the outdoor walks that have been going on for over 25 years, this information is much more widely available.
Okay, well, thank you. This is terrific. So if people watch this on Facebook Live, great. Otherwise, you can still see this on Facebook page of Comcast or Channel 14 Norwich. It will be on my Facebook page. It will be on YouTube. And then for everybody in Norwich who has Comcast TV, it will be aired, I'm sure, many times where you can listen to Fay and watch this interview. So thanks again, Fay, so much. And we will see everybody next time on Talkback. Bye. Thanks again.
Bye.